Okay, this is the second section of the economic anthropology lecture. Here we're going to talk about 6 systems of exchange. The 3 major systems of exchange that we will discuss are reciprocity, redistribution, and market exchange, including, not for long, but we'll touch on market capitalism as well. So reciprocity, redistribution, and market exchange. First one's reciprocity. The basic definition of reciprocity is off to the left here. It is an exchange of goods or services of more or less equal value among people of more or less equal status. Right. So there aren't huge differences in the values of things that are exchanged. There's not really much difference in the status of the people involved. Reciprocity, in general, is an exchange of goods or services among people of equal status. Those exchanges are more or less of equal value. Now that has there are 3 different subtypes of reciprocity. First one is generalized, second is balanced, third is negative reciprocity. We'll go through each one of them here. In generalized reciprocity, there is exchange without a specified time or amount of repayment. Right, exchange without a specified time or amount of repayment. One example of that we've already come across is the food sharing system in hunter-gatherer groups. Often they have what's excuse me. Often they have what's called a mechanical solidarity, in which people are heavily interdependent on one another for their day-to-day survival, and so they know that if they do something for somebody, that favor is going to be returned at some point. Right? They're going to be around the same people their entire lives, pretty much. They're going to depend on each other as they move through life. So if you do something for somebody, then they'll do something for you later. In the food sharing systems specifically, we talked about how they break down we used the whale example, how they break down the whale and divide it up first according to how people contributed to procuring the food, and then they broke it up in terms of their family obligations and then any other obligations that they might have had. Excuse me. So that there was no the point here is that there was no guarantee that you were going to get any whale at all on any given day. The amount of whale that you might get out of a hunt was highly variable, and so you wouldn't be guaranteed to be able to pay anybody anything on any given day. And so you can see how that would lend itself to a generalized reciprocity system. That's often the case in hunting and gathering circumstances. Because of this mechanical solidarity and the general unreliability of income, they in the form of food and things you need to survive, they have a generalized reciprocity system. Another example of generalized reciprocity is the relationship between parents and children. Right, everybody has parents. You grow up, your parents do all kinds of stuff for you. It's huge. It costs about $250,000 to raise a kid from birth to college. Right, it's a huge amount of money, huge amount of investment. They don't send you a bill for that at the end or anything like that. They're not taking notes as you go along. There's an assumption that you're going to be looking out for them to a certain extent as well. That's just part of the deal. And their parents did the same thing for them. Right, so it's something that gets passed on. There's no formal agreement or anything like that. Nobody's talking about time and amount of repayment or anything like that. So that's an example of generalized reciprocity. Another example that we can probably relate to is I'll spot you. Right? If you go out with your friend to get a cup of coffee and your friend forgets their wallet, then you might spot your friend. So you buy their coffee that time. And then they say, I'll get you back. Right? So you don't know exactly when they're going to buy you a cup of coffee, but probably at some point in the future they'll buy you a cup of coffee, and it'll probably be roughly of equal value, or they'll do something else for you. Right? And you don't really worry about it because you have that relationship that guarantees the exchange. So that's an example of generalized reciprocity that comes up in our regular life. Balanced reciprocity is exchanged with a specified time and amount of repayment. And most of the transactions that we engage in our economic system fall into the category of balanced reciprocity. If you go to buy your coffee, never mind about your friend for the moment, but if you just go to buy a cup of coffee at a coffee shop, then you give them a certain amount of money, they give you a certain amount of beverage, and the exchange happens immediately on the spot. So the time and amount of repayment are specified in that exchange. So the vast majority of the exchanges that we have fall into the category of balanced reciprocity. Bank loans, right? If you take out a loan, then they spell all that stuff out in the paperwork. Right? You're going to pay X amount over X period of time until you pay off the loan, the principal and the interest of the loan. That's another example of balanced reciprocity. Now, negative reciprocity is exchange for the purpose of gaining advantage, and that advantage can come in any of a number of different ways. Let's look back at the potlatch that we spoke about in the first part of this lecture. If you recall that, it's a ceremony that happened among Pacific Northwest Indians in North America. Right? They had to give away all their stuff or burn it in order to gain prestige. That is an example of negative reciprocity. It was an example of conspicuous consumption, because they were consuming resources in order to enhance their prestige. It was an example of a leveling mechanism, because they had to give away or destroy this stuff in order to get the prestige. It's also an example of negative reciprocity, in that it was exchanged for the purpose of gaining advantage, and that advantage took the form of prestige. Right? They weren't gaining wealth as a result of doing that. They were gaining prestige. Their respect in the eyes of other people around them went up because they could do it. So that is one way of exchanging for the purpose of gaining advantage. Also, most of the interactions transactions that we engage in, go back to our cup of coffee, it's balanced reciprocity, because we're paying for a certain amount for the thing at the time getting the thing. The time and amount are specified. It's also negative reciprocity, because the person's making coffee and selling it in the first place in order to gain the advantage of wealth. Right? We understand we're working within a capitalist system, and part of that system is profit. That is the motive for a lot of economic activity. So they're only making the coffee for you so that they can make a profit. So they're going to be able to charge you a little bit more for that cup of coffee. And you'll pay it because it's worth it to get the coffee, and you don't want to make it yourself. So it's accepted that they're going to make a little bit more. It's worth it to you to get the coffee. So that, certainly bank loans, you could see the parallel there. That's negative reciprocity. They charge interest on the thing, and so they're going to make more money. So it's it's negative reciprocity in terms of gaining wealth. That's your advantage. It's not gaining prestige, it's gaining wealth. So we can see many different forms of this. Balanced and negative obviously do not mutually exclude each other. Right? So something can be balanced and it can be negative at the same time. On the other hand, it can't be balanced and generalized at the same time. Usually, generalized reciprocity is not negative reciprocity. But it certainly cannot be balanced reciprocity. They are mutually exclusive. The next one. Next major type of exchange is redistribution. And this is a circumstance in which goods are collected in a centralized location and distributed from there. All right, so it necessitates a society that is at least complex enough to have centralized location, that is, organization. Not that there's no organization in hunting and gathering groups. We'll talk a lot more about that when we get to the section on politics, which is coming up soon. Generally, I was hesitating on which terms to introduce here. I'll tell you, in the politics section, we're going to break human political organization down into 4 different categories: bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states. And bands and tribes are considered to be acephalous, meaning they don't have centralized authority. And that's a big distinction that's important here. Whereas chiefdoms and states do have centralized authority, and so they allow things like redistribution. You don't find redistribution generally in bands or tribes, that is, groups without centralized authority, because there's no way to organize the central, the first distribution and then the second distribution. There's no centralized location, really. The chiefdom or state, there certainly is. And a chiefdom might actually be the chief's house. That person has authority. You can distribute things to the chief's house, and the chief can distribute it a second time to the places it needs to go, other people in the group. In our system, in a state, we have something called taxation. All right, there's 2 different types of redistribution. First is tribute, second is taxation. In a tribute system, the payment comes in product. Meaning if you're growing corn on your farm and the chief wants to redistribute some of that corn, then you pay a certain percentage of the corn. You actually bring bushels of corn over to the chief's house, right? And the chief will then distribute the corn out. In a taxation system, the only difference between tribute and taxation is in a taxation system you have monetary units. And I think we mentioned monetary systems in the subsistence lecture. It's a means of abstracting the value of goods into money. Right? So we can capture some of the value of the things that we produce, even though we lose track of the things. We sell them or whatever we do. So we don't actually have to have the things to have some of the value, capture some of the value that was created in that system. So that's the major difference between tribute and taxation. Taxation requires a monetary system. Right? Tax is paid in money. And our centralized location in a state is the federal government, in this case the state governments, the IRS specifically for the federal government. And we send our tax payments in monetary units, money. We send them in dollars in the United States. Right? You can't take a bunch of bushels of corn and send them to the IRS. They're not going to accept it. Right? It's not going to count against your tax bill. If we had a tribute system, that's how that would work. We wouldn't have any monetary units. We'd just bring portions of whatever we were producing down to the IRS. But our system is too large and complex. We really couldn't get by with a tribute system. That's redistribution. The final type of exchange is market exchange, which is trade based on supply and demand. And that's something everybody is pretty much familiar with just from normal life in a Western country, right? Probably any country, really. Basic idea is if there's a lot of demand for something and there's low supply, then the price goes up. If there's a lot of supply and there's not very much demand, then the price goes down. Right? So people produce according to this demand relation. Right? So trade based on the principle of supply and demand is market exchange. And markets can take a lot of different forms, obviously. If you go down to Walmart, that's a market. If you go to, I think it's in Southeast Asia, they have a floating market on the canals in the city, and people just pile all their goods on top of the boats and go up and down the boats, go up and down the canal, selling to other people on other boats, but also people on the shore. And that's a very different form of market, but it's still market exchange. Right? It's a matter of how the thing is conducted, or what the pattern of exchange is, rather than how it's particularly conducted. It can be in a Walmart, can be on a river, it doesn't matter. Market exchange is based on supply and demand. Alright, we'll stop there on this one. That's good enough. We could get into capitalism a little bit in the global capitalist system. We kind of touched on that during the previous section in the subsistence lecture, I think. We don't really need to get too much further into that at this point.